Going to finish up World War I, Part 3. We're going to start with the fighting in the war, some of the technologies and the battles, and then we're going to finish up with the fight over the Treaty of Versailles that ends the war. So, Roman numeral E, war over there, the Yanks arrive in France. If you remember, the United States took a while to get involved in World War I because we wanted to be isolationists, as we had said on our previous parts to this lecture. And now Americans finally starting arriving in France, and the United States Army that's going to France is going to be called the American Expeditionary Force. They arrive really with just in the nick of time. Germany had been attacking France and England on the Western Front for about 3.5 years now, and England and France were quite literally out of men and materials. Germany knows this, and they're going to make one last push to try to end the war before the U.S. can get too involved. And so Germany makes this last-ditch drive to Paris, as you can see in the map, but the United States get there with 1.2 million fresh soldiers, and they get there just in time to stem the German advance. So when this German attack is over, Germany has nothing left. Just like England and France, they're out of a whole generation of men. Their economy is broke. And they're out of war materials. And so that pretty much sums up the United States' involvement in the war. It comes out at the very end, and when the United States can get soldiers there just in the nick of time, Germany has shot its last gasp. They are done. And so Germany starts to talk to the United States, Great Britain, and France about terms of surrender. So the threat, and like I said, Germany is out of men, and the United States is just sending over their first batch of men. They can continue to bring in more fresh troops, war supplies, and Germany knows that the war is over. And so let's talk about combat before we talk about the treaty that ends the war. And so combat during the war is trench warfare. The reason soldiers did this is because we're using modern machines now. And so we see that troops have machine guns, and when you're not attacking, you don't want to just stand there in an open field and get mowed down by a machine gun. So the troops dug in, and eventually these foxholes that they dig will be connected as trenches. And for the most part, the Western Front does not move that much either way, east or west, throughout the course of the war. There are these big human wave attacks. So let's say the general says, well, let's go defeat the Germans. And so they blow a whistle, and all of these million of troops go over the top out of their trenches, and they charge right at German machine guns, and they just get mowed down. Or vice versa, the Germans charge at the Allies. And so this is a horrible meat grinder of a war. On average, there's about 1,000 casualties a day on the front lines. So not only were machine guns something that was adding up casualties, but modern artillery, barbed wire that would get people hung up on the lines. We see the flamethrower invented at this time. So all kinds of new weapons we're going to see are going to cause just catastrophic casualties in this war. Another one is we see the first instance of chemical warfare, something called mustard gas. Mustard gas was a poisonous gas in the form of a shell. You would lob it at your enemy. The shell would explode near your enemy lines, and then this kind of mustardy gas color would start spreading, and if you got a small whiff of it, it burns your skin, and so it might make you go blind if you weren't able to get a gas mask on time. And so we see these long lines of soldiers going back from the front who've been blinded for life because of these gas. Or if you get a little bit more, it might make you go crazy because it'll start to burn away your brain. Or, of course, how it mostly kills if people didn't get gas masks on time. It would just burn your lungs from the inside out. So horrible new weapons in the war. We see at the end of the war the evolution of the tank. As we go from trench to trench, people realize that if you can put some armor around a vehicle, that will allow you to get across what we call no man's land in between the trenches. And so by the end of the war, we're going to see the beginnings of tanks, and so when we get to World War II, we'll have more modern tanks. Another invention we have is the airplane. The airplane was invented by two Americans, Orville and Wilbur Wright, in 1903. And from 1903 to 1914, we're going to see tremendous acceleration of the aviation industry. In 1903, when the Wright brothers were able to take the first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the plane did not get very far off the ground, just a few feet off the ground, and it only lasted about a 30-second flight or so. And so to go from that to these biplanes and triplanes, these fighter planes, we see just the pace of technology is certainly increasing as we lead up to World War I, creating new and better weapons. And so when we look at casualties, you don't need to know these numbers by heart, but I do show you this because Russia, Germany, France, and the British Empire, they're going to have, these are not just casualties, these are just deaths. This doesn't include all the wounded. And so the Russia, Germany, France, England, they're devastated by the war. As I said on a previous slide, literally a whole generation, which we'll call the lost generation, is gone in these countries. The United States has about 53,000 deaths, which is a lot considering the short time we were at the war, but nothing like what we see Europe suffer. And so, just so you know and make a note of this, is when World War I is over, Europe is broke. They're bankrupt. They're out of men. They're in debt from the war. Their factories have been strained or destroyed. And so we see Europe is certainly going to have a tough time recuperating from this war. Next, so we'll go back a couple of slides. The United States arrives in Europe, the American Expeditionary Force. They're there for those one or two major battles, which Germany tries to push to Paris. And when the Americans stop the German advance, like I said, Germany knows that they're out of soldiers and materials, and the Americans are fresh and just getting involved in the war. And so Germany asks for an armistice, which means a cessation of fighting, stop fighting. And the United States said no. They said, we are not going to let you stop fighting until you get rid of your king, your Kaiser. And so Germany was forced, if they wanted the war to end, they had to get rid of their king or their Kaiser. Woodrow Wilson did this because he said, 14 points, we are making this war to make it a better place. And Wilson believes that a democracy is the best kind of government for everybody. And so Germany will eventually get rid of their Kaiser and replace it with an elected government called the Weimar Republic. So on November 11th, 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day, World War I comes to an end. Of course, today we celebrate that as Veterans Day, but at that time they called it Armistice Day. So, peace treaty. So now the war is over, and so Woodrow Wilson decides that he is going to be the first president ever to leave the United States during his time in office and go personally oversee the signing of the peace treaty. Now, you would think that Woodrow Wilson would be a very popular president. After all, he was president while we won this big war. But that's not going to be the case. There's lots of people that are unhappy with Woodrow Wilson. Labor unions are not happy with Woodrow Wilson because, if you remember, Woodrow Wilson made the worker fight rule. And so if labor unions went on strike in some key industries, they were drafted. And so labor unions don't like that. Plus, inflation went up during World War I. And so even though labor unions did get paid more than what they had before, their real wages went down, wages adjusted for inflation. And so labor unions are not happy with Wilson and his war. Farmers are not happy either. If you remember in the past, they have voted for Wilson. He did do some things to help farmers before World War I, but during World War I, in order to keep inflation under control, so that factory workers could afford food, the Wilson administration put fixed prices. They put a maximum amount of money that farmers could make from the war. And farmers didn't like this. They were angry because they thought this was a chance for them to make a lot of money. There was a high demand for their farm goods. And so they see that Woodrow Wilson has betrayed them. He's kept them in poverty. Eastern businessmen don't like Woodrow Wilson because he's a progressive. He's done some things to bust up trusts. Under him, we've had the 16th Amendment, the Revenue Act, and so they've been paying really high taxes. And so Woodrow Wilson doesn't have the support of businessmen either. And, of course, the Republican Party doesn't like him because Wilson is a Democrat. But they also don't like him because they think that Wilson is grandstanding. Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to sign the peace treaty, and he didn't ask any Republicans from Congress to go with him. And that is probably a mistake because, of course, as you know in your Constitution, Wilson can bring home a treaty, but it's up to the Senate to sign the treaty. And the Senate at this time is controlled by Republicans, and they are simply just upset with Wilson for not including them, taking all the credit, and they're going to fight him on any treaty that he does bring home. So Wilson goes to Paris, and he, as you can see in this picture, he's a hero. He may not be as well liked at home, but when he goes abroad to Europe, he certainly is. English and French see the Americans as somebody that came and helped them win the war at the time that they was most needed. And so Wilson is greeted by tremendously adoring crowds. And so they sit down at the palace at Versailles, right outside of Paris, and Woodrow Wilson and the English and the French sit down and draft what would be known as the Treaty of Versailles. And so, if you remember, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was that he wanted to make it so that we never have another war. So we wanted to take away all the reasons for having war, and one of those was ethnic self-determination. He wanted conquered peoples all around the world to control their own government. He thought that this would end empire, which is one of the reasons that nations fight each other for control of resources and empire. He also thought it would spread democracy, give the people in Mozambique control of Mozambique instead of having the English or Portuguese or whoever control their countries. And so when Woodrow Wilson sits down at Versailles, he says to England and France, look, this is my idea. I think we need to end empire. And England and France say, no way. They said, look, they're not our 14 points, they're your 14 points, and there is no way we're going to give up our colonies around the world. Especially after World War I, England and France are broke, and they need those colonies' raw materials and markets to help recover. And so Wilson cannot go home and tell the people of America that, I told you were fighting to end empire, and then we don't end any empire. And so Woodrow Wilson says, well, what about what about Germany's colonies? Germany lost. What about the Ottoman Empire's colonies? They lost too. And England and France say what we'll do is we want to take them over. Woodrow Wilson, again, is in a problem. He can't go back and tell Americans that your boys died so that England and France could get bigger. They could get more colonies. He promised us that we were fighting to end empire, not to make England and France's empire bigger as they gobble up Germany and the Ottoman Empire's colonies. And so he has to figure out what to do. And so what he does is he calls colonization or imperialization just by a new name. He calls it the mandate system. And so some of the Ottoman Empire's colonies, what's going to happen to them is England is going to gobble them up. But so Woodrow Wilson doesn't get in trouble when he gets home. England agrees to treat them as quote-unquote mandates. In other words, England will control the colony for a period of time that's yet to be determined until the people of the Ottoman Empire are able to have democracy for themselves. But until that time, England gets to benefit from all the raw materials, oil, resources of the former Ottoman or German colonies. This is very similar to what we've seen before in the Jones Act, where the United States promised the Philippines their independence once they've earned it, once they've demonstrated they can be democratic. And so we see that in the Treaty of Versailles too. Of course, it really is just imperialism all over again. We're just calling it the mandate system now. Next, England and France are very upset by the war. Like I said, that they lost a whole generation of young men. They're broke. And so England and France forced Germany to sign what is called the War Guilt Clause. Germany has to say that it's their fault that the war started, which is nonsense. Germany, England, and France are all about the same guilty for this. If you remember, the war started when a terrorist attacked the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then everybody else got pulled in because of secret treaties. But Germany lost, and so they're going to have to take the blame for the war. And this makes the German people really, really angry. They've lost their colony, so they're no longer a great power, and they're going to have to take the blame for a war that they didn't start any more than anybody else did. Now, if Germany has to take the blame for the war, then that means they also have to pay for the war. We call this reparations. A reparation is when you have to pay because you lost. And so this means that as England and France are struggling to regain their economy after the war, Germany is going to pay them money for all the bullets and the troops, uniforms, and everything else that they had to pay for the war. And so England and France will recover from World War I, but Germany won't. Germany is going to be broke and angry for a good long time. And of course, these are creating a situation in Germany where Adolf Hitler can come to power in the 1930s and play on some of this situation that the Treaty of Versailles set up. The Germans are angry that they have to take the blame for the war, and so Hitler will say, look, it's not our fault. The Germans are angry that they've lost their empire. Hitler will say, I can, make us great again and give us empire. And the Germans are upset because they're broke, and he says, follow me, and I can make us wealthy again. And so to some extent, we do see the Treaty of Versailles that's so harsh towards Germany that it's creating a lot of resentment that will eventually, in a way, lead to World War II, as Germany is going to be ripe for somebody to come in and take over and say, I'm going to make things better. Next, European allies force Woodrow Wilson to really give up all of his 14 points except for one. If you remember, Woodrow Wilson convinced Americans, most Americans, that this was a good war because we were going to fight to end all future wars. It was a noble, progressive crusade. We're going to make the world a better place. But that's just not going to be the case because all 13 of the 14 points are not going to be passed. And so there will be more wars, and people are going to be very disappointed in Woodrow Wilson and resentful back in America that he made these grandiose promises, and he's not able to deliver on many of them. And so we're going to see what that will cause later. But there is one point that Woodrow Wilson is going to get England and France to consent to, and that is his most important point, his 14th point. He says that we will have a League of Nations, which for Woodrow Wilson is the most important thing because even if he doesn't get anything else, if nations have a place to go to peacefully address their concerns, then he hopes that eventually we'll be able to end all future wars, even if he didn't get some of the other 13 points. And so, peace, the last major section of these notes. And so we're going to have the fight over the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson comes home with the treaty. It's not the best treaty he could come up with. He wanted more of his points, but he does have the 14th point, the League of Nations, and so he comes back to that Republican Senate and he says, okay, pass my treaty. And of course they're upset with him. I told you there was a lot of groups upset with Woodrow Wilson. Americans, when they see this treaty, they don't see ethnic self-determination. They don't see freedom of the seas. They don't see the end of secret treaties. All they see is that England and France got wealthier, they got more colonies, and it doesn't look like we've really accomplished any of our goals, and so Americans think, oh my gosh, our boys died for nothing. But Woodrow Wilson says, no, they didn't die for nothing, we have the League of Nations. And so we see in this picture Wilson coming home with the League of Nations, with the Treaty of Versailles, but the Republicans don't want to pass this. They don't want to pass it for many reasons, but the biggest one is that the Treaty of Versailles, the 10th part of the Treaty of Versailles, something called Article 10, what it says is that the League of Nations will have the power to enforce peace. So if, let's say, the United States attacks Nicaragua, well, they're both members of the League of Nations, the United States and Nicaragua, and what that means, Article 10 says, is that if one country attacks another, the whole entire rest of the world, the League of Nations, they have permission to attack that aggressive country. So in our example, if the United States, let's say, were to attack Nicaragua or Cuba or Haiti or whatever, the whole rest of the world will be able to attack the United States. Article 10 is really the heart and soul of the League of Nations. This is what is going to keep future wars, because if you're a country and you are aggressive towards another country and attack them, well, then you're going to just have to be attacked by everybody else. And so this is the whole thing that we think will keep war from happening. Nobody wants to, have to face the rest of the world. And so this attack against one is an attack against all idea is Article 10. And this is what's going to make the League of Nations work. But the Republicans in the Senate don't like this because they say that this will violate the Monroe Doctrine. They say that the United States has control over the Western Hemisphere, and if we need to invade a country, Roosevelt Corollary, or we need to use dollar diplomacy to protect American businesses, we should be able to do that without having the rest of the world get involved in our business and send support to the nation that we attacked. And so they don't like this. They also don't like the idea that if the United States joins the League of Nations, that we would have to get involved in other people's wars. So let's say that Romania attacks Italy. Well, that would mean that the United States would have to go to war to defend Italy because an attack against one is an attack against all, and we don't want to do that. After World War I and we got nothing out of it, the Republicans in the United States Senate are going to be isolationists. They want the rest of the world to stay out of our business, and we want to stay out of everybody else's business. And so Woodrow Wilson is not going to get this passed as the treaty stands through the U.S. Senate. So what does Wilson do? So what Wilson does is he decides, well, if I can't convince the Republicans in Congress that this is a good idea, I'm going to go above their heads. I'm going to go out to the people, and he gets on a train and he goes around the United States trying to convince the people of the United States through personal appeal that this is a good treaty and they should support it, and they should write to their Republicans in the Senate and get them to approve the treaty. It's a bold move, and he can only really do this now because we have direct election of senators by the people. And so as Woodrow Wilson moves around the country giving speeches why this is a good treaty and people should tell their congressmen to vote for the treaty, Woodrow Wilson gets to Pueblo, Colorado, and he has a massive stroke. He's debilitated for the rest of his presidency. He has a tough time speaking or walking, and so he can't lead the fight for the treaty anymore, and it's going to be very difficult for him to continue with his presidency. And so in the lack of presidential leadership, what we're going to see is a United States Senator, a Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. He says to Wilson, he says, look, we'll sign your treaty. We will sign your treaty, except he says we will add an amendment to the treaty. It's called the Lodge Amendment. It's named after Henry Cabot Lodge. He says we will sign on to the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, but just without Article 10. He says we'll go to the League of Nations, we'll do everything we need to do, but we will not allow Article 10 to affect what we do here in America. And so that is the Lodge Amendment. So Woodrow Wilson, he has a choice. He can let the treaty pass without Article 10, or he cannot. Now, the reason Wilson won't compromise. Woodrow Wilson believes that the League of Nations, without Article 10, without this idea of an attack against one as an attack against all, it would just make the League of Nations pointless. Because if one nation attacks another nation without Article 10, they're completely free to do so without any retribution. And so Woodrow Wilson does not compromise on this, so the treaty is stuck. The United States will not sign this treaty. So now we have the election of 1920. Woodrow Wilson has served 2 terms. He could serve another, constitutionally, but he's not going to. If you remember, he's very sick from his stroke. And so Woodrow Wilson does not run again, but we do have a guy by the name of James M. Cox, which you can see in the picture, is running for the Democratic nomination, and his vice presidential candidate is somebody we're going to talk a lot about in the future, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a young Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the Democrats are running on the platform of yes to the treaty, the whole treaty, with Article 10, no Lodge Amendment, and so that's what they're primarily running on. The United States should go to the League of Nations, they should take part in it, we should be engaging the rest of the world. The Republicans, they nominate Warren G. Harding, who you see on the right, and then Calvin Coolidge, who's on the left. And the Republicans say that no, if you vote for us, we will not join the League of Nations. We will not allow there to be Article 10. We are for the Lodge Amendment, if anything. And so Americans in 1920 really have a choice. They have a choice of the Democrats and progressivism and joining the League of Nations and being involved in the rest of the world, or they have a choice of the Republicans and forgetting progressivism, going back to pro-business, and saying we're going to be isolationists and we're not going to engage the rest of the world. And so we certainly see that American voters in 1920 have a definite choice between the two. And if we look at the election returns, America is not in the mood to be progressive anymore. That's why this election is so significant, because we see that Harding and Coolidge are going to win, popular vote 60%, electoral vote 76%, and we see that the progressive age is over. That's what the election of 1920 says. Americans are angry. They were told by Woodrow Wilson that the World War I would make the world a better place. They were told by the progressives that we could get rid of crime in cities, we could end corruption in the government, we could shrink the wealth gap, and they just didn't see anything that was good. It didn't seem to make America better, all of these years of progressivism, and it didn't seem to make the world a safer, better place. The imperial powers were still the imperial powers. America lost 53,000 men in World War I, and it really looks like progressivism has been discredited. And so we're now going to end the progressive era, and our next era is really a return to the Gilded Age. Americans are no longer in the reforming mindset. They just want to go back to the Gilded Age if they can, make money, have a good time, not do reform, and it's what we call the Roaring Twenties. It's all about making money and having a good time, and we don't see a lot of reform in the 1920s. And so certainly this is a period change. We see America's focus going to be shifting.